The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered streets of Harmony Falls, Texas, a town where pickup trucks outnumbered cars 3-1, and everyone knew their neighbor's business better than their own. Population 3,847, according to the faded sign at the town limits, though nobody had bothered to update it in the last decade. Sarah Mitchell pulled her Honda Civic into the gravel parking lot of Henderson's funeral home, the same establishment that had been serving the community for over 50 years. The building's white wooden siding needed fresh paint, and the small garden out front showed signs of the brutal Texas summer they'd just endured. She sat in her car for a moment, gathering the strength she'd need for the day ahead. At 34, Sarah had seen her share of loss working as a registered nurse at Harmony Falls General Hospital. But losing her father felt different. Robert "Bobby" Mitchell had been the town's go-to mechanic for nearly 40 years. The kind of man who'd fix your car for the cost of parts and throw in a cold beer while you waited. He was known for his gentle nature, his terrible jokes, and his habit of humming old country songs while he worked under the hood of someone's broken-down Chevy. "You doing okay, honey?" The voice belonged to Margaret Henderson, the funeral director's wife, who had appeared beside Sarah's car window. Margaret was a woman in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and the kind of warm smile that had comforted countless grieving families over the years. Sarah rolled down her window and nodded, though her red-rimmed eyes told a different story. "As okay as I can be, Mrs. Henderson. Thank you for everything you've done. Dad would have appreciated the care you've taken." "Bobby was a good man," Margaret said softly. "One of the best this town ever had. The service is set for 2 o'clock, and I expect we'll have a full house. Half the town brought their cars to him at some point." Sarah stepped out of her car, smoothing down her black dress. The October air was crisp, a welcome relief after months of oppressive heat. She'd chosen her father's favorite hymn, "Amazing Grace," for the service, and asked Pastor Williams from the First Baptist Church to keep his eulogy simple. Bobby Mitchell hadn't been a complicated man, at least not as far as anyone in Harmony Falls knew. The funeral home's interior was exactly as Sarah remembered from her grandmother's service 10 years earlier. Burgundy carpet, dark wooden pews, and the perpetual scent of lilies and furniture polish. Bobby's casket was positioned at the front of the room, surrounded by modest flower arrangements sent by friends and customers. Above it hung a simple wooden cross that had been in the Henderson family for generations. "Sarah, sweetheart." The voice belonged to Betty Crawford, her father's next-door neighbor for the past 15 years. Betty was a widow in her 70s, who had appointed herself as the unofficial keeper of neighborhood news. She approached with her arms outstretched, pulling Sarah into a hug that smelled of vanilla perfume and mothballs. "I still can't believe he's gone," Betty whispered. "Just last week he was out there in his garage, tinkering with that old motorcycle of his. Seemed healthy as a horse." Sarah nodded, though the memory stung. Her father's sudden heart attack had been swift and mercifully brief, according to Dr. Peterson at the hospital. Bobby had been working late in his garage when it happened, and by the time Sarah arrived at the emergency room, he was already gone. "Miss Mitchell," a young man approached them, notebook in hand and a press badge hanging from his neck. He was tall and lean, probably in his late 20s, with brown hair that looked like it hadn't seen a proper barber in months, and intelligent blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "I'm Jake Harrison, from the Austin Herald-Tribune. I was wondering if I could ask you a few questions about your father." Sarah frowned, confused. "I don't understand. Why would a newspaper from Austin be interested in my dad's funeral? He was just a mechanic in a small town." Jake glanced around the room, then leaned in slightly. "That's just it, Miss Mitchell. We received a tip this morning that Willie Nelson might be attending the service today. My editor sent me to cover it, but nobody here seems to know why he'd come to Harmony Falls for your father's funeral." "Willie Nelson?" Sarah's voice rose slightly, drawing looks from nearby mourners. She lowered it to a whisper. "That's impossible. My dad never mentioned knowing Willie Nelson. He liked his music, sure, but then again, what Texan doesn't?" Jake shrugged. "Could be a mistake, but the tip came from a reliable source. Someone spotted his tour bus on Highway 35 heading this way earlier today." Before Sarah could respond, a murmur began to spread through the gathering crowd. People were pressing toward the windows that faced the parking lot, and she could hear fragments of excited whispers. "Is that really him? I told you I saw the bus. What in the Sam Hill is Willie Nelson doing in Harmony Falls?" Sarah pushed through the crowd to reach the window, Jake following close behind. There, parked next to Margaret Henderson's sedan, was an unmistakable black tour bus with Willie Nelson written in flowing script along the side. As they watched, the door opened and Willie Nelson himself stepped out, wearing his characteristic braids, a black suit, and his famous red bandana. The legendary country music star looked older than in his recent photographs, his weathered face showing every one of his 89 years, but he moved with the same quiet dignity that had made him an icon. He carried a worn acoustic guitar case in one hand and what appeared to be a handwritten letter in the other. "I'll be damned," whispered Tom Bradley, who owned the gas station down the street. "That's really Willie Nelson." Sarah felt her legs go weak. She grabbed Jake's arm for support, her mind racing with questions she couldn't begin to answer. Her father had lived his entire adult life in Harmony Falls. He'd married her mother here, raised Sarah here, and as far as she knew, had never traveled further than Dallas. What possible connection could he have had to one of country music's greatest legends? Willie Nelson approached the funeral home's front door with purposeful steps, nodding politely to the growing crowd of onlookers, but not stopping to sign autographs or pose for pictures. There was something solemn about his demeanor, something that suggested this wasn't a publicity stunt or a case of mistaken identity. Margaret Henderson hurried to open the door for him, her usual composure clearly shaken by the unexpected celebrity appearance. "Mr. Nelson," she managed to say, "we're honored to have you here, though I have to admit, we're all a bit surprised." Willie Nelson's voice was exactly as Sarah had heard it on countless albums. Soft, weathered, and tinged with the wisdom of someone who had lived through more than his share of life's ups and downs. "Ma'am, I'm here to pay my respects to Bobby Mitchell. If it's all right with his family, I'd like to sing something for him." All eyes turned to Sarah, who felt as though she was trapped in some sort of dream. The man who had sung "On the Road Again" and "Crazy" wanted to perform at her father's funeral, and she had absolutely no idea why. I don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How did you know my father?" Willie Nelson's eyes met hers, and she saw something there that looked like sadness, mixed with regret. "Ma'am, I knew your daddy a long time ago. We had some unfinished business, and I reckon this is my last chance to make things right." The funeral service that was supposed to begin at 2 o'clock was delayed by 30 minutes as word spread through Harmony Falls like wildfire. Cars and pickup trucks began arriving in a steady stream, parking along the street and in nearby lots as the small funeral home filled beyond capacity. People who hadn't seen each other in months suddenly appeared, drawn by the unprecedented occurrence of a country music legend showing up to honor one of their own. Sarah found herself in Margaret Henderson's office, sitting across from Willie Nelson, while Jake Harrison scribbled notes in the corner. Having somehow convinced Margaret that he needed to document this historic moment for posterity. The office was cramped, filled with filing cabinets and funeral service supplies, but it offered privacy away from the growing crowd. "Mr. Nelson," Sarah began, still struggling to process the surreal situation, "I need you to understand that I'm completely lost here. My father never mentioned knowing you. We talked about everything, his work, his friends, his past. I've lived in this town my whole life, and I've never heard even a whisper about him having connections to the music industry. Willie Nelson set his guitar case gently against the wall and pulled out the letter he'd been carrying. The envelope was yellowed with age and had been opened and refolded many times. Your daddy wrote me this letter about 15 years ago. I kept meaning to write back, but you know how life gets. Time slips away faster than you think it will. He handed the letter to Sarah, who opened it with trembling fingers. Her father's familiar handwriting filled 2 pages of lined notebook paper, the kind he used to keep in his garage office for writing up repair estimates. Dear Willie, the letter began, I don't expect you to remember me, and I sure don't expect you to write back, but I felt like I needed to tell you something that's been weighing on me for over 30 years now. Sarah looked up at Willie Nelson, then continued reading. As she progressed through the letter, her father's secret life began to unfold before her eyes. According to his own words, Bobby Mitchell had spent 2 years in Nashville in the early 1970s, trying to make it as a songwriter. He'd lived in a rundown apartment near Music Row, worked construction during the day, and spent his nights in the honky-tonks, playing his songs for anyone who would listen. I was going by my real name then, Robert Michael Turner, the letter continued. I'd changed it when I left home because I was running from some trouble back in Texas. Nothing serious, just young man's foolishness. But I thought a fresh start might help. I met you at the Bluebird Cafe one night in 1973. You were just starting to get noticed, but you were still playing the small venues then. Sarah paused in her reading, looking up at Willie Nelson with wide eyes. Turner was his mother's maiden name. I knew he'd used it when he was young, but I thought that was just because his parents weren't married when he was born. Willie Nelson nodded slowly. Bobby Turner. I remember him now. Quiet kid. Probably about 22 or 23 then. He had a way with words that was different from most of the songwriters I was meeting. His stuff had more heart in it, you know? Less about the business of music and more about the truth of living. The letter went on to describe how Bobby had written several songs during his time in Nashville, including one called Midnight Highway Blues that he'd played for Willie at the Bluebird Cafe. According to the letter, Willie had been impressed enough to ask for a copy of the lyrics and music, promising to help Bobby get it to the right people. But then life got complicated. The letter continued, I got word that my father was dying back in Texas, and I had to come home fast. I left Nashville so quickly that I never got to follow up with you about the song. By the time I got back to Texas and dealt with family business, months had passed. I wrote you a couple of letters, but I never heard back, and I figured you'd probably forgotten all about me and my song. Sarah turned the page, her heart pounding as she began to understand where this story was heading. A few years later, I heard Midnight Highway Blues on the radio. But it wasn't credited to me. It was listed as written by Willie Nelson and Buddy Cannon. Now, I'm not saying you stole my song on purpose. I know how these things can happen in the music business. Maybe you forgot where you got it. Or maybe Buddy changed it enough that it became something different. But hearing my words and my melody coming through the radio, knowing that song was helping make you famous while I was back here in Texas fixing cars, well, that hurt more than I care to admit. Willie Nelson closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. Midnight Highway Blues, he said quietly. That song went to number 3 on the country charts in 1976. It was one of the songs that really established my career. I remember that song, Jake said from his corner, pen still moving across his notepad. It's been covered by dozens of artists over the years. The royalties alone must have been substantial. Sarah continued reading, her father's voice coming through clearly in his carefully chosen words. I want you to know that I'm not writing this letter to cause trouble or to ask for money. I made my peace with it years ago. I came back to Harmony Falls, married a wonderful woman named Linda, and we had a beautiful daughter named Sarah. I built a good life here, fixing cars and being part of this community. But as I get older, I find myself thinking about those days in Nashville and wondering what might have been different if I'd been braver about fighting for what was mine. The letter concluded with a paragraph that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. I'm writing this because I want you to know that there are no hard feelings. Your version of Midnight Highway Blues was better than mine ever could have been. You gave it the soul it needed to reach people, and that's what matters. Music is supposed to heal people and bring them together, not divide them with arguments about who wrote what. I just thought you should know the truth, in case it matters to you. Maybe it doesn't, and that's okay too. I hope life has been good to you, Willie. You deserve all the success you've had. Sarah folded the letter carefully and looked up at Willie Nelson, who was wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He sent this to you 15 years ago? Yes, ma'am. And I'm ashamed to say I never responded. I remembered Bobby Turner as soon as I read it, and I remembered that song he played for me at the Bluebird. Truth is, I used his basic melody and about half his lyrics, but over the years, I'd convinced myself that I'd written the whole thing. Memory can be a funny thing when you want it to be. Willie Nelson stood up and walked to the small window that looked out over the funeral home's parking lot, where even more people were gathering. I tried to find him several times over the years, but Robert Turner had disappeared. I never thought to look for Bobby Mitchell in a small Texas town. If I had... He trailed off, shaking his head. What would you have done? Sarah asked. I would have made sure he got his proper credit and his share of the royalties. That song made a lot of money over the years, and your daddy deserved his part of it. More than that, I would have apologized. I would have told him that he was right. His version had a truth to it that I tried to capture in mine, but I never quite managed it. Jake looked up from his notes. Mr. Nelson, are you saying that Bobby Mitchell co-wrote one of your biggest hits, and he never received any credit or compensation for it? Willie Nelson turned back to face them. That's exactly what I'm saying, and that's why I'm here today. I can't give Bobby the recognition he deserved while he was alive, but I can make sure people know the truth about him now, and I can try to make things right with his family. Sarah felt a mixture of emotions wash over her: pride in her father's hidden talent, anger at the injustice he'd suffered in silence, and confusion about why he'd never told her any of this. Why didn't he ever say anything? All these years, he just let it go? Your daddy was a good man, Willie Nelson said. Better than most. He could have made a big fuss, could have hired lawyers and fought for what was his. But according to his letter, he chose to build a life here instead. He chose family over fame, community over career. That takes a special kind of courage. Margaret Henderson knocked on the office door. I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have people standing outside now. The sanctuary is full, and folks are asking when we can start the service. Willie Nelson picked up his guitar case. I think it's time we gave Bobby Mitchell the send-off he deserves. With your permission, Miss Mitchell, I'd like to tell people who your father really was. And I'd like to sing Midnight Highway Blues, the way he wrote it originally. Sarah nodded, still processing everything she'd learned. I think Dad would like that. As they prepared to leave the office, Jake Harrison stood up. Miss Mitchell, this is an incredible story. Would you be willing to let me write about it? People should know the truth about your father. Sarah looked at Willie Nelson, who nodded encouragingly. I think my dad kept this secret long enough, she said finally. It's time people knew that Bobby Mitchell was more than just a mechanic. The sanctuary of Henderson's funeral home had never seen anything like it. Every pew was packed, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The crowd was an unusual mix of Harmony Falls locals and curiosity seekers who had driven from neighboring towns after hearing the news on social media and local radio stations. Pastor Williams, a thin man in his 50s who had been delivering eulogies for over 20 years, stood at the podium looking slightly overwhelmed by the unprecedented turnout. He'd prepared standard remarks about Bobby Mitchell's life of service to the community. But the presence of Willie Nelson had clearly changed the nature of the event. Sarah sat in the front row, flanked by Betty Crawford and her father's closest friend, Frank Morrison, who had owned the auto parts store where Bobby bought his supplies. Frank was a bear of a man with calloused hands and a gray beard, who looked completely bewildered by the circus surrounding his friend's funeral. "I don't understand any of this," Frank whispered to Sarah. "Bobby never said nothing about Nashville or Willie Nelson. Hell, we used to listen to Willie's music while we worked on cars. If Bobby had written one of his songs, don't you think he would have mentioned it?" "I'm learning that Dad kept a lot of things to himself," Sarah whispered back, her eyes on Willie Nelson, who sat in the second row with his guitar across his lap. The country music legend looked solemn and focused, occasionally nodding to people in the crowd who recognized him, but maintaining the respectful demeanor appropriate for a funeral. Jake Harrison had positioned himself near the back of the room with his notebook and a small digital recorder, documenting what was shaping up to be one of the most unusual stories of his journalism career. He'd already called his editor in Austin, who was equally amazed by the developing narrative and had given Jake permission to stay in Harmony Falls as long as the story warranted it. Pastor Williams cleared his throat and began the service with a prayer, his voice carrying over the unusually large and diverse congregation. "We are gathered here today to celebrate the life of Robert Mitchell, known to all of us as Bobby, a man who served this community with dedication and kindness for nearly 4 decades. He spoke about Bobby's work as a mechanic, his willingness to help neighbors in need, and his quiet strength in the face of life's challenges. The standard eulogy that Sarah had heard at dozens of other funerals in this same room. Words that painted a picture of a good man who had lived a simple, honest life. But then Pastor Williams paused and looked toward Willie Nelson. However, it seems that Bobby's life was more complex and interesting than many of us knew. We have with us today someone who knew Bobby in a different time and place, and who has a story to tell that will help us understand the full measure of the man we're here to honor. Willie Nelson stood slowly and made his way to the front of the room, carrying his guitar. The murmur that had been running through the crowd quieted to absolute silence. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. "Friends," Willie Nelson began, his distinctive voice carrying easily to the back of the packed room. "I'm honored to be here today, though I wish I had come to Harmony Falls years ago to meet with Bobby while he was still with us." He looked out over the crowd, making eye contact with people throughout the room. "How many of you have heard the song Midnight Highway Blues?" Dozens of hands went up throughout the sanctuary. It was, after all, one of Willie Nelson's most beloved songs, and this was Texas. Well, I need to tell you all something about that song that I should have said publicly a long time ago. Midnight Highway Blues wasn't entirely my creation. The heart of that song, the melody, and many of the words that made it special came from a young songwriter I met in Nashville in 1973. His name was Bobby Turner, but you all knew him as Bobby Mitchell. The silence in the room was so complete that Sarah could hear the ticking of the old clock on the wall behind the podium. People began to look at each other with expressions of amazement and confusion. Willie Nelson continued, "Bobby wrote to me about 15 years ago, telling me the truth about our shared history. He told me he'd made his peace with what happened, that he wasn't looking for money or credit. But that doesn't make what happened right. And it doesn't excuse the fact that I never responded to his letter or tried to make things right while he was still alive. Frank Morrison leaned forward in his seat, his mouth slightly open. "Bobby wrote songs?" he whispered to Sarah. Willie Nelson pulled out a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "Bobby sent me the original lyrics and music for Midnight Highway Blues with his letter. I want to read you some of his original words, because they tell a story about a young man's dreams and the hard choices we all have to make in life." He unfolded the paper and began to read in his weathered voice. "Driving down this midnight highway, thinking about the life I left behind. Small-town dreams in my rear-view mirror, wondering what I'm gonna find. Music City lights are calling, but my heart keeps pulling me back home. Sometimes you gotta chase your dreams, and sometimes you gotta learn to roam." Several people in the crowd nodded, recognizing the familiar melody and similar lyrics from the famous version of the song, but hearing them with new understanding. "Bobby Turner could have stayed in Nashville," Willie Nelson said. "He had talent, real talent. But when his family needed him, he came home to Texas. He chose responsibility over recognition, family over fame. And he never complained about it. Never tried to make me or anyone else pay for the opportunities he gave up." Willie Nelson set the paper aside and picked up his guitar. "I want to sing Bobby's song for you today, the way he originally wrote it, because I think it tells us something important about the kind of man he was. This is Midnight Highway Blues by Bobby Mitchell." See, the first notes of the familiar melody rang out in the quiet sanctuary. But Willie Nelson's interpretation was different from the recorded version that had made him famous. This version was slower, more contemplative, with subtle differences in the lyrics that made the song feel more personal and raw. As Willie Nelson sang, Sarah found herself crying not just for her father's death, but for the dreams he had sacrificed and the recognition he had never received. She looked around the room and saw that many others were similarly moved, including people who had known Bobby Mitchell for decades, but were learning about this hidden chapter of his life for the first time. When the song ended, the applause was long and heartfelt. Willie Nelson waited for it to die down before speaking again. "I want you all to know that I've been in touch with my lawyers and my music publisher. We're going to make sure that Bobby Mitchell gets proper credit as co-writer of Midnight Highway Blues. And we're going to make sure that his family receives the royalties that should have been his all these years." The crowd stirred at this announcement, and Sarah felt her breath catch. She hadn't been expecting anything like this. "But more important than the money," Willie Nelson continued, "I want people to know the truth about Bobby Mitchell. He wasn't just a good mechanic and a good neighbor. He was a songwriter with real talent who chose love over ambition, community over career. That's a lesson all of us could learn from." Willie Nelson looked directly at Sarah. "Your daddy was proud of you, Miss Mitchell. In his letter, he wrote about watching you grow up to be a nurse, helping people in this community just like he did. He said that you turned out to be everything he had hoped for in a daughter, and that made all his sacrifices worthwhile." Pastor Williams returned to the podium for the closing prayer, but the tone of the service had been completely transformed. What had begun as the funeral of a simple mechanic had become a celebration of a complex man who had lived with dignity and grace, despite giving up his dreams. As the service concluded and people began to file out of the sanctuary, Sarah felt overwhelmed by the number of friends and neighbors who stopped to speak with her. Many expressed amazement at what they had learned about her father, while others shared memories of Bobby's kindness and generosity over the years. "I can't believe Bobby never told us about his songwriting," said Helen Martinez, who ran the local diner where Bobby had eaten lunch most days. "But it makes sense now, you know? He always had music playing in his garage, and sometimes I'd catch him humming songs I'd never heard before. I bet those were his own compositions. Frank Morrison approached Sarah with tears in his eyes. 30 years I worked with that man, and he never said a word about Nashville or writing songs. But you know what? It doesn't change who he was to us. He was still the same Bobby, who'd drop everything to help you fix your car or lend you money when times were tough. Jake Harrison was busy interviewing people throughout the crowd, documenting their reactions to Willie Nelson's revelations. The story was getting bigger by the hour, and he could already envision the headline, "Local Mechanic's Secret Life as Nashville Songwriter Revealed at His Own Funeral." But for Sarah, the most important revelation was still sinking in. Her father had been a dreamer once, a young man with musical aspirations who had given up everything to come home and take care of his family. And he had done it without bitterness or regret, building a life of service and contentment in the small town where she had grown up. As the crowd thinned out, Willie Nelson approached Sarah one more time. "Miss Mitchell, I hope you'll let me stay in touch. I meant what I said about the royalties and the credit. But more than that, I'd like to learn more about the man Bobby became after he left Nashville. I think there's more to his story than even I know." Sarah nodded, still processing everything that had happened. "Mr. Nelson, thank you for coming today. Thank you for telling the truth about my father. I think he would have been proud to know that his song reached so many people, even if his name wasn't on it. His name should have been on it from the beginning," Willie Nelson said firmly. "But we'll make sure it is now. That's a promise." 3 days after the funeral, Harmony Falls was still buzzing with the revelations about Bobby Mitchell's secret life as a songwriter. The story had spread far beyond the small Texas town, with news outlets from Dallas, Houston, and even Nashville calling Jake Harrison for interviews and additional details about the remarkable funeral service. Sarah had taken the week off from her nursing job to deal with the aftermath of her father's death and the unexpected media attention. She found herself fielding calls from journalists, music industry representatives, and even a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell Bobby's story on film. It was overwhelming, but also strangely healing to hear person after person describe her father as a hero for choosing family over fame. On Thursday morning, Sarah was going through her father's belongings in his garage workshop when she discovered something that made her heart race. Hidden behind a stack of automotive manuals was a wooden box that she had never seen before. Inside, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves, were dozens of handwritten songs, musical notation, and what appeared to be a partial memoir about Bobby's time in Nashville. "Oh my God," she whispered to herself, reading through page after page of her father's creative work. The songs covered a wide range of topics: love, loss, small-town life, the struggles of working people, and the bittersweet nature of growing older. Some were complete compositions with both lyrics and music, while others were fragments of ideas that Bobby had apparently never finished. One song in particular caught her attention. It was titled "Small Town Heart" and appeared to have been written relatively recently, based on the paper and ink. The lyrics told the story of a man who had once dreamed of musical stardom but found greater satisfaction in the simple pleasures of community life. "Used to dream of stadium lights and crowds that knew my name. Now I find my peace in simpler things, and I'm not ashamed. There's music in a neighbor's laugh and rhythm in the rain. Sometimes the biggest dreams come true in the smallest ways." Sarah was so absorbed in reading her father's hidden works that she didn't hear the knock at the garage door until it became more insistent. She looked up to see Jake Harrison standing outside, his notebook tucked under his arm, and an excited expression on his face. "Miss Mitchell, I hope I'm not intruding, but I've got some news that I think you'll want to hear," Jake said as she opened the door. "Please, call me Sarah." And actually, I'm glad you're here. I just found something that I think you'll find interesting too." She gestured toward the wooden box, and its contents spread out on Bobby's workbench. Jake's eyes widened as he took in the collection of songs and writings. "Are these all your father's compositions?" "It looks like it. There must be 50 or 60 songs here. Maybe more. Some of them look like they were written back in his Nashville days, but others are much more recent. Look at this one." She handed him the Small Town Heart lyrics. Jake read through the song quickly, then looked up with amazement. "This is incredible, Sarah. Your father never stopped writing music. He just kept it to himself all these years. What was the news you wanted to tell me?" Sarah asked, though she was still distracted by her discovery. "I've been doing some research into your father's time in Nashville, trying to verify the timeline and details from his letter to Willie Nelson. I found some interesting things." Jake pulled out his notebook and flipped to a marked page. "I tracked down some people who were part of the Nashville songwriting community in the early 1970s, and several of them remember Bobby Turner." Sarah sat down on a stool beside the workbench, giving Jake her full attention. According to a woman named Linda Sue Patterson, who was a singer trying to make it in Nashville around the same time, Bobby was well known among the struggling songwriters. She said he was incredibly talented, but also incredibly shy. He would play his songs at open mic nights, but he never pushed himself forward or tried to network the way most ambitious songwriters did. Jake flipped to another page. "But here's the really interesting part. Linda Sue told me that Bobby wasn't just writing songs for himself. He was writing songs for other people, customizing them for specific singers' styles and voices. She said he had an unusual ability to capture what made each performer unique and write songs that fit them perfectly." "That sounds like Dad," Sarah said. "He was always good at understanding what people needed, whether it was fixing their car or just listening to their problems." "There's more," Jake continued. "I also spoke with a man named Eddie Ramirez, who was a session musician in Nashville during those years. He remembered Bobby Turner very well and said that several songs Bobby wrote were recorded by different artists. But Bobby never got credit because he sold the songs outright for small amounts of cash. Apparently, he needed money to survive, so he would take whatever he could get rather than wait for potential royalties." Sarah felt a pang of sadness for her young father, struggling to make ends meet in a competitive city far from home. "How many songs are we talking about?" Eddie thought it might be as many as a dozen songs that became regional hits for various artists. Nothing as big as Midnight Highway Blues, but songs that helped other people's careers, while Bobby remained completely unknown. Jake paused, looking at Sarah with a mixture of excitement and concern. "Sarah, if even half of what these people are telling me is true, your father might have been one of the most unrecognized songwriting talents of his generation. He was essentially a ghostwriter for the Nashville music industry." Sarah looked down at the collection of songs spread across her father's workbench, and he never said a word about any of it. He just came back to Texas and fixed cars for 40 years. "But he never stopped writing," Jake pointed out, gesturing toward the more recent compositions in the box. "These newer songs show the same talent, maybe even more developed. Your father spent decades refining his craft in private, never sharing it with anyone." Sarah picked up another song from the collection, this one titled "The Mechanic's Blues." As she read the lyrics, she realized it was essentially her father's autobiography in song form, telling the story of a man who had traded his musical dreams for the more practical work of keeping